Hello there, welcome to an in-depth review of Limbo, a puzzle platformer game first released in 2010 for Xbox 360. It was developed by Playdead and originally published by Microsoft Studios as part of their Xbox Live Summer of Arcade promotion. Now this is going to be a pretty in-depth review. I'm going to be talking about the game in an awful lot of detail. If you haven't played the game before, I'd suggest you definitely do that before watching this video, because otherwise it's just going to suck all the fun out of it. With Playdead's new game, Inside, due out for Xbox One early next year, what better time than now to take a look back at Limbo and examine what made the game such a success with fans and critics alike. What were its strengths, what were its weaknesses, what was the game all about? Let's see if we can't work out the answer to those questions and more in an in-depth critique of Limbo. So one of the first things that probably strikes you when you start Limbo is the minimalist approach to, well, pretty much everything really. There's no intro or prologue, there's no setup to the plot or the character, there's no indication of what the game's going to be about. It just begins. In fact, your character will just lie there until you start pressing buttons to wake him up. All you do know about the game is that you're in Limbo, because it's called Limbo. This opening for me does a couple of things. One, by not giving you any information whatsoever, by forcing you to be the one who initiates gameplay rather than the game doing it for you, it kind of lets you know that you're on your own. You'll only have yourself to rely on, no one else. The game is not going to hold your hand, so in this sense the game starts as it means to go on. And the second thing it does is create a real sense of uneasiness. Most games will in some way establish a setting. Knowing who you are and where you are and what you're doing is pretty much a staple of conventional storytelling in games because, it makes you feel familiar with your surroundings. But by purposefully not doing this, Limbo makes you feel lost and alienated. So as you begin your journey, it's with a real kind of trepidation because you don't know what to expect. And so within the first 60 seconds you're already on edge, and this is smart because this is achieved not by doing certain things you wouldn't expect, but by not doing things that you would normally expect. And it's a really clever way to open the game, and it's actually pretty indicative of the experience as a whole. Limbo is a subtle game, and by that I mean it doesn't really attempt to achieve its goals through spectacle or through overload of the senses. But mostly it does things through a quiet, subdued ambience and tension. It's a game that feels perfectly distilled. There is nothing superfluous in it. Everything that's made it into the final build is there to cleverly serve a purpose, but done in a way so that you don't notice, so as to never break your immersion. Examples of this can be found when you look at various aspects of the game. So looking at the character animation and the level design, the way your character interacts with the objects around him, the way he puts his hands up when walking into things or instinctively reaches out to objects with which he can interact, it feels like there's a tangible relationship between your character and their environment, and these clever and subtle animations, they're there so you don't have to have immersion breaking on-screen tutorials. So you instinctively know that you can drag a crate because of the way your character reacts to it when he's near, not because the game has told you to press B to interact with an object. And this kind of subtlety extends to the way in which you approach puzzles. There's something really organic about the way your character feels and interacts with the world around him, like a believable physics, breaking through glass by jumping from a certain height, using your body weight to anchor ropes, breaking twigs. Everything has this kind of believable gravity and weight. You need to pay attention to the details around you in order to solve puzzles. Visual clues, sounds, the weight and movement of objects. And it's these subtle details that help create such an immersive game world. So if we take a look at the visuals, the 2D art style may appear to look pretty simple, but there's a lot more going on than meets the eye. There's an excellent use of foreground and background in Limbo. Faint images of things off in the distance add depth. They give the game world a sense of scope and vastness beyond what you actually see. Trees and reeds and things in the foreground also help create a sense of depth, but they can also be used in other interesting ways. For example, early on in the game the camera slowly zooms in and the frame is filled with foliage. It creates the impression that you're being spied on, that you're not alone. And this is significant because it happens right before you encounter other people for the very first time. So there's always a lot of careful thought gone into the composition of the frame and the various things happening within it. The black and white visuals, the complete lack of colour reflect the bleak, death-themed nature of the game. In fact, the grainy flickering film effect, the darkened corners, almost give me the impression of like squinting, like you're watching through the eyes of someone on the verge of death. The design of the boy is also deceptively simple. Limbo has no kind of head-up display whatsoever, and particularly there's no health bar. Your character is a black silhouette but for a pair of glowing eyes, and these eyes convey one simple message: alive or dead, as they're the only two states that exist within the game. So the player quickly learns that because there's no health, there's no damage, and so if something looks like it might kill you, it will kill you. The eyes also make the character stand out against the dark backgrounds, almost like a target. It creates a sense of vulnerability. You are life in a game where you're surrounded by death. Lastly, both music and sound design are noticeably scarce. In fact, I'd say the area in which Limbo is at its most minimalist is perhaps the sound design, which is pretty unusual for a game like Limbo, which is working pretty hard to be both atmospheric and scary. To not have much in the way of sound is a bold move. So for example, in the forest you might expect to hear off-screen wildlife or creepy wind noises, but you don't. You might expect to be overwhelmed with the sound of heavy machinery rumbling away all around you in the factory, but you aren't. And as a general rule of thumb, if you can't see it, you can't hear it. And the reason this is unusual in terms of sound design, but why it's also really smart, is because sound is like life. If you want to bring a world to life, you create a soundscape where you can hear all sorts of different things around you. And without actually seeing those things, the sound alone will create an impression of them in your mind. But Playdead have done the complete opposite. If sound represents life, then Limbo's absence of sound represents death, perfectly in keeping with the tone of the game. This is also a really fantastic example of what I said earlier. There is nothing superfluous in Limbo. Everything in it is there for a reason. So let's examine the reasons behind the sound effects that did make the cut. The most consistent sound throughout the game is the sound of your own footsteps. This places emphasis firmly on you and not the environment. By isolating you in the soundtrack, it increases your sense of isolation in the game. It also allows for a striking contrast between the almost therapeutic sound of your movements and sounds that are used to signify danger, as generally you only really come across other prominent sound effects when you encounter some kind of threat. Flaming tyres, buzzsaws, a crack of electricity, and so sound is used to evoke a greater sense of fear in the player. Music is also used so sparingly and is so stripped back in terms of its compositions that a lot of people claim there was no music. There's no elaborate orchestral arrangement which tells you exactly what you should be feeling and when. It's far more ambiguous than that. It's more about conveying a sense of atmosphere and ambience. Rather than the music attempting to reflect and emphasise whatever is happening on screen, like it would in most games with a conventional score, it's there to be interpreted by you as a player, allowing it to reflect whatever it is you might be feeling at that moment. So what are some of those things you might be feeling? What is it the game is trying to evoke through its atmosphere? Well, I think the game has certain themes and connotations such as loneliness, isolation, depression, and it uses beautifully scripted moments to achieve this. For example, while conveying loneliness and isolation might seem like a pretty straightforward task for a game in which you spend most of the time alone, for me the moments where this came through most strongly is actually when you do encounter other humans. The shocking moment when you approach another person for the first time and they kill themselves right in front of you. The wonderful Lord of the Flies-esque moment when you meet a bunch of other kids in a group and instead of welcoming you into their group, they attack you and try and kill you using homemade booby traps. These encounters help to create a sense of absolute despair that you won't find solace in the presence of other people. You are truly alone. Every interaction with other humans involves death in some way, and for a game that might initially look like a kind of cute Tim Burton kind of family film, almost like a cartoon, it turns out to have some incredibly dark and gruesome content. Suicide, killing children, using the bodies of dead children as stepping stones. The game is relentlessly grim, and it's all part of conveying the misery of the game's setting. I think fear is also a key part of the atmosphere. The act with the spider, probably the most iconic section of the game, is used to evoke fear and doesn't just do it by preying on people's arachnophobia. It also does a few clever things on top of that. The moment where the spider catches you and cocoons you in his web, that's something the game does on a few occasions. It takes control away from you. It puts you in situations where you're powerless to control things happening around you and you have to think and react quickly or you'll die. Not having full control in a platform game or a game with so many traps that are out to get you, it puts you on edge because it makes you feel especially vulnerable. Also, in that same scene with the spider, your ability to move freely is then inhibited. You're being chased by this spider and you can't run properly. That's another thing that the game does a few times. It gives you a kind of handicap where you're not free or able to move or escape or deal with certain situations in the way you would like to. And the last thing the spider section does, the very first time you encounter him, is force you to do something that you don't want to do. That's something the game is also excellent at. It forces you to do things that go completely against your instincts, your natural desire to avoid danger and risk. and by forcing you to go right up to the spider with a bear trap and wait till the last moment to move, creates such a feeling of peril, makes you feel uncomfortable. It's something the game does frequently in a variety of different situations, whether it's making you jump over giant buzzsaws or running over electrified floors. You're always forced to take risks with your life. Playing it safe is just not an option you're afforded. This intention to always put you on edge, this extends to the level design also. One of the developers' primary goals when designing the game was to make it feel as if the world itself is an enemy, as if everything is out to get you, and they pulled it off brilliantly. Again, this is achieved in a few ways, and the scripted moments like jumping over buzzsaws, they're examples of that, but the most interesting way, I think, is through the game's use of trial and error. Trial and error is something often used as a criticism towards a game. It's often seen to be the product of lazy or badly executed development, some kind of botched attempt at difficulty or challenge in a game. But Limbo embraces trial and error in a way I hadn't seen before. The game knows you're going to die repeatedly, it expects it, in fact it goes out of its way to engineer it and often trick you into being killed. Take this example. Near the beginning there's a rope with what looks like a rotting corpse hanging off the end of it, and it's weighing the rope down. First time you come across this part, the chances are you're going to jump on the rope, swing and attempt to grab the ledge. It won't work, you won't be able to make the jump, and the developers know this and they know where you're going to land because they've hidden a bear trap in that exact spot tucked away in the darkness where you weren't going to see it. It's exactly that kind of devious, sly trickery that helps create this impression that the game world is actively out to get you, but it's also really clever level design, because dying in Limbo isn't a punishment, and this is the perfect example. It's likely that you need to die to solve this puzzle. Failure here teaches you two things: that you can't make that jump with the rotten flesh attached to the rope, and that the bear traps chomp flesh when touched. So in this instance, by dying, you're taught everything you need to know about how to solve the puzzle. Trial and error is a fundamental aspect of Limbo's game design, but instead of being annoying, it's actually rewarding, because when you feel like the game world is actively against you and out to get you, solving puzzles brings with it a sense of reward, like it's competitive. It's you versus the game, and each puzzle you solve brings you closer to victory, which I guess you could say about any puzzle game, as it's kind of the nature of the genre to try and stump you, but by being so unabashedly forthright about its desire to torment you, Limbo just elevates that feeling of satisfaction to a new level. The game also cleverly sidesteps any frustrations often brought about by failure states in games by always treating you to a gloriously over the top and gruesome death animation, and by having near instant reload times and frequent checkpoints, so you're never forced to wait ages for a respawn or replay huge chunks of the game. But the best thing about all of this is that it ties into the theme of the game. Trial and error and death as a result of it all has a context here. It ties in with the idea of being stuck in limbo, destined to live out the same nightmares over and over and over again. It makes perfect sense with the setting, and it's a nice relationship between form and content. I also think it's really clever to take one of the core aspects of not just platforms but nearly all games in general, death or failure state as a result of not being able to best the game's difficulty. It takes that and subverts it, so that instead of that being a punishment or something that impedes your progress, it's a key tool in aiding your progression. So, pretty good so far, but is Limbo without its flaws? Well, I don't have any major problems with the game personally, but there are some common areas of complaint I've seen, some of which I can understand. It has to be said that the level design and the setting, backdrops, they're all at their strongest during the first half of the game. Towards the end it's all a bit less memorable. A lot of people were quite critical of the game's later stages, finding that they just aren't in keeping with the atmosphere and tone of the earlier stages, which is fair enough. There is a definite difference. I personally don't mind the late stages of the game so much. They're a lot more nightmarish and abstract than the earlier ones. It gives me the impression of descending further and further into madness or something, and the gun turrets and elaborate buzzsaw obstacles, plus the absence of any other people, all gives me the feeling that I'm trespassing and venturing into areas in which I shouldn't, where no one has gone before. So while I don't necessarily agree that these sections feel out of context within the themes or tone of the game, they are a lot less evocative and powerful than the earlier levels, and they lack the memorable set pieces. Also visually they're a lot less interesting and lack the mystery and wonder of the earlier settings. The tone, the forest, even the sewers, they're all quite striking settings. There isn't much of that towards the end of the game, unfortunately. In terms of gameplay, there's also a shift in the kind of puzzles you start to see. So where the puzzles near the start all require quite lateral thinking, towards the end they become a lot more challenging in the sense that they require very precise timing. So the challenge becomes not about figuring out what to do, but in actually doing it and pulling it off without dying. which I think for a lot of people can become quite frustrating, especially if they're having to keep repeating the same section over and over and just want to progress. And when a game impedes your progress in that way, through difficulty, that can break your immersion much faster than if you're just stuck because of a puzzle you can't work out. I mean, you can always look that up online and see what to do. Now, some people will say, well, that's not the game's fault, that's the whole point of a game, especially a puzzle or a platformer, is to provide challenge, and if it was easy, then what's the point? But others would say that in a game so driven by atmosphere and immersion, if some players are finding it so difficult that it ruins the atmosphere and takes you out of the experience, and I guess you could say that's a flaw in the game, as that kind of contradicts what I think is one of the core principles, to never break your immersion. But this is all entirely subjective. It's something that depends on you as a player. Some people, myself included, won't have that problem at all. They find the balance to be just right. But for some, it will be a major drawback. A lot of criticism was levelled at the length of the game, that it was too short, especially considering its price. I didn't feel it was too short. I mean, it's not a long game, certainly, and when you're really enjoying something, you wish it would just go on forever. But I didn't feel ripped off because I enjoyed it so much, and I felt like I'd purchased a truly unique and memorable experience, and that's definitely something that I would say is worth paying for. Also, for me, the game had a nice little bit of replay value in its achievement for finding the hidden objects and the grueling less than 5 deaths playthrough, which I really enjoyed going for. It was a real challenge. But I can understand that if some people expect more from games these days in terms of length or replayability, but at the end of the day, I'm personally one of those people that believes I'd rather a game left me wanting more than outstaying its welcome. Finally, the only other real criticism I've encountered is towards the game's story, the narrative, or rather the lack of one. The promotional material told you that you're searching for your sister, but the game itself doesn't actually explicitly even tell you that. A lot of people criticise the game for its vague approach to story and meaning. Personally, I prefer it. Most of the game's themes and ideas are conveyed visually through images and scenery, even little background details, and I think that's far more exciting than just having something told to you. And I kind of like it when something is deliberately vague and ambiguous, as it allows you to attribute your own meaning to it. Limbo doesn't try and assert any kind of meaning on the player, but there's enough to suggest ideas for anyone that is interested and wants to look for more. And that approach isn't for everyone, and that's fair enough, but for me, that's right up my street. But what is the game about? What are those themes? Well, in Catholicism, Limbo, meaning the edge of hell, is a place where unbaptised children would go if they died. So I guess it's noteworthy that you're in control of a child who is searching for his sister, who's also suggested to be a dead child. Much has been read into the opening chapter select screen and the final screen of the game and how they merge together, with people interpreting these two shots as bookends to the game's story. I've read some really interesting theories about how the sister fell from a treehouse and died, or something to do with a car crash and how smashing through the glass at the end represents the car windshield. There's some really interesting theories out there. I personally have a bit of a different spin on the game. For me, the specifics of what caused you to end up in Limbo is less important than what you're supposed to learn from being there. Now, I don't have a concrete theory about the game. I mean, like, this means this and that means that. It's just certain feelings and ideas that I get when I play the game, and it's the overall tone that it evokes. But personally, I like to interpret the game as being about grief, loss, and maybe even suicide. I guess my interpretation uses the more broad definition of Limbo as being like stuck, not moving, not knowing what to do or where to go, which ties into grief, as I think Limbo is often a term used to describe the grieving process, feeling like your world has ended, not knowing how to move on. I think maybe someone you love, your sister, has died, maybe in an accident, maybe it's your fault, but you're overcome with grief, and I wonder if the game is exploring the issue of suicide when people take their own life because they can't deal with their loss and want to be closer to a loved one. I wonder if part of the reason I interpret it this way is due to the tagline, uncertain of his sister's fate, a boy enters Limbo. It says you enter Limbo to find your sister, as if you deliberately gone there with a purpose, which suggests to me suicide rather than an accidental death. But obviously in Limbo it doesn't bring you any closer to your sister, it just brings you more misery and despair. You actually see her at one point and she vanishes. It's something elusive that you can't find or reach. It's also worth noting that you're the only person in the game who has eyes, nobody else, including your sister. So these things suggest to me that she isn't actually real and you'll never find her. You're alone in your own sort of personal hell. And there's a real change in tone too over the course of the game. The music at the start is quite tranquil, almost beautiful and peaceful, and the forest is relatively calm. But as the game progresses, the world and the music get more and more aggressive and nightmarish. So basically, imagine that you cannot bear to be a part of this world anymore, you cannot cope with the grief of your sister's death, Suicide is going to release you from that. You'll be in a better place. You'll be with your sister. And Limbo, if you buy into the idea of sin and punishment, because suicide is considered a sin, you find yourself in a place that isn't better than where you were, and you don't find what you're looking for. And the journey in the game from beginning to the end, and the shift in tone, is you realising that you don't want to be there anymore, but you can't escape. You regret what you've done, you realise it was a mistake, but it's permanent. The ending with the two screens merging only for you to begin the whole process again from the beginning maybe reflects that permanency of death and the pointlessness of suicide because you didn't find your sister. I don't know, I admit it's a pretty tenuous interpretation of the game's meaning, but just the way the game depicts the afterlife is utterly bleak and miserable. It doesn't romanticise death at all, and that's something that came through quite strongly for me. Really made me think about suicide. I mean, like, not contemplating suicide, but just about grief and loss and that kind of stuff. But that's the great thing about Limbo for me. It's a game that's very much open to interpretation, and because its meaning is quite ambiguous, no theory is really wrong. It only has to mean whatever you want it to mean. So that's Limbo then. For me, it's one of the most evocative games I've played on this generation. Every aspect of the game, the visuals, the music, the gameplay, the setting, they all work together in perfect harmony to create this emotional tone and atmosphere that for me is every bit as powerful, every bit as immersive, if not more so than its big budget rivals. Yet it does all of this in a really interesting way. Limbo succeeds by pulling back in areas where other games would push forward. By stripping the game of certain characteristics and conventions, it ends up achieving much more than I think it would if they'd included them. So Limbo is most definitely worthy of its status in my opinion, but what do you think? Let me know in the comments, let me know if you've agreed or disagreed with the stuff I've said, and tell me what you think the game's story was about, because I genuinely really love reading about other people's interpretations of games like this. Any feedback you guys give me really means a lot, so yeah, if you've enjoyed this, please like, do subscribe because I'm going to be doing more in-depth reviews, and feel free to check out my others. Thanks for watching, bye!